Hello everybody and welcome to today's edition of the UKEndZone Football Daily Podcast. We've got a terrific pod for you today. We're talking with Dave Revsine from the Big Ten Network and with his brand new college football book out, and it is an unbelievable read. We're going to get right into it in just a second. First of all, I want to let you know, if you are a college football fan, make sure you go and check out UKEndZone.com. In the next few days, and already up there is the ACC one, we're doing some conference previews. Myself and Josh Hunt, who you'll have heard in this pod before, we're doing some previews. We've got the Big Ten coming out very soon, which makes it pretty damn nice. We got Dave on today. So let's just jump straight into it with me and Dave talking about the early beginnings of college football, some of the hero superstars, how it translates to today, and also some Big Ten football, how Braxton Miller's injury impacts Ohio State, impacts the league, and the league as a whole. Alright then, every now and then you get one of those interviews where you get excited for it to happen, and the guy I'm going to welcome on now is Dave Revsine from the Big Ten Network, and he's the author of this sensational new book, which I'm just made up with. It's unbelievable right now. It's called The Opening Kickoff, The Tumultuous Birth of a Football Nation. It's a college football book that takes us way back to the 1800s. Dave, how are you?
I'm great, Ollie. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm genuinely excited. This book is unbelievable. Tell me about it. How did this come about?
Well, first of all, I've just got to tell you that for an author and someone who spent 4 years on something, it really means a lot to hear you say that. I mean, so genuinely, I feel that it is, it is such a solitary pursuit when you're writing a book, and then to finally be able to share it with people and to have them have the reaction that you had to it is great. So I appreciate that. As to how it came about, I stumbled upon an article about this guy, Pat O'Day, who, as you know, is really a central figure in the book, who was an Australian guy, came over to the United States when he was in his 20s, looking for his brother, who turned out was the crew coach at the University of Wisconsin. And Pat O'Day became one of the first great superstars of American college football. And I was just completely taken in by his story, which I found remarkable as a player. And then he had this bizarre twist in his life that I just thought was really interesting. And so I started down the path of telling his story. But it became apparent to me in reading about him and reading about everything else that was going on at the time that he was really just part of the story and really kind of part of what was a bigger tale, and that was the tale of college football in that time period and kind of how we got to the point that we're at today. Because I think to really understand college football in the United States today, you have to understand the origins of the game and the time period that I focused on.
You know, I love the timing of when the books come out as we move to this new era of college football, and it gives people that chance to go back and reevaluate what's happened in past eras. You could have wrote a book about the BCS, about how good the SEC is compared to other conferences, but we'll leave that to Mr. Feinbaum. And my favorite thing about it is when you look at the narratives of the different individuals, the schools, the beginning of the Ivy League schools, how similar, and you put this right at the start of the book, how similar it is to like a Johnny Manziel with Pat O'Day.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of similarities between Johnny Manziel and Pat O'Day and how the media covered him. He had a relationship of some sort with Dame Nellie Melba, who was maybe the most famous female performer in the world at the time, Australian opera star. Not exactly sure what that relationship was, but I have a sense as to what it may have been. And that was covered kind of breathlessly in the papers. Everywhere he went, he was a huge deal. And he wasn't alone. I mean, I start the book, as you talk about, with this 1893 game between Yale and Princeton. It was played in New York City. There were 50,000 people at the game in 1893. The New York Sun sent 17 reporters to cover it. They devoted nearly a quarter of the next day's paper to the game. So this notion that kind of, well, we're in this unique time here in college football and it's never been this big. I mean, I would argue scope and scale of the time, it was maybe bigger then in the Northeast than it is today. That's an area of the country that obviously isn't all that focused on college football. But that just kind of blew me away. I mean, this idea of how big it was then, because it was completely counter to the notion that I had of what it was.
How did we even get to that initial era with the Ivy League? Because you write about how it was almost just a fun game where they'd drink and they'd have big banquets and then they'd play some football. And I'm guessing one day they sat down and they were like, the egos got involved with these big schools, and then they were trying to steal each other's, scholars, athletes from each other's schools to try and improve themselves. How did we get to even that point where they were like competitively starting to even like pay players and things of that nature?
Well, I think it's interesting, Ollie. I mean, I think to a certain extent, there's just a human nature component to it. I think that whenever you're competing on any level, people want to win. And the year that I kind of say was the turning point year was 1876. So the first game was 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton. So I argue for about 7 years it was sane. And then it went off the deep end in 1876 because Yale decided they wanted to win. Yale was kind of the first football factory. And Walter Camp, as I say in the book, was the foreman, kind of the founder of American football to a large extent, the guy who drew up all the rules. He was the advisor to Yale's team, kind of what we think of as the coach today. And it just kind of went off the rails then. Yale decided they wanted to win. The other schools kind of followed suit. And within about 15 years, you were dealing with a major enterprise that schools saw as a great public relations mechanism and a way to build the name of their university. I mean, the ultimate example that I use is the city that I'm in is Chicago, and the University of Chicago is now world renowned for Nobel Prize winners, but it was founded very late for American colleges. It was founded in the early 1890s, and they saw football as a way to put themselves on the map, to compete instantly with Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. It would take a long time to build a reputation as an academic institution, but you could win in football right away. All you needed to do was let in a couple kids who had no interest in being there other than playing football, which is exactly what they did. And very quickly they garnered a national reputation. And so it's fascinating to see that very early on, American universities came to the realization that this could be a public relations mechanism for them. And it explains why this is the only culture in the world where college football or college athletics in general, where you have this notion of this large-scale athletic enterprise attached to a university, because it makes no sense on the surface. But here's why it happened.
Looking at the research then of how you were able to get the book, when I read it as a writer, and I was explaining this to someone today, it reads like a great thesis with all the research done, but then also because the storyline's like a great novel. How did you find that balance, and how did you do all the research to find these things from so long ago?
Well, I spent a lot of time on it. It took me a lot longer maybe than it should have. Part of it is I have a full-time job and I have a family, and so I kind of had to fit it in. But part of it was I was just so blown away by it. I mean, I think you just kind of reach this point where you say, man, there's such an amazing story here, and no one's ever really told it. How is it that no one's ever told this story in a book like this? I mean, people had told it in kind of academic ways, but they had never told it in a narrative way. And that's what I read. I read narrative nonfiction. I love it, mostly sports narrative nonfiction. And so it kind of became a quest. How am I going to tell this story, and how can I tell it in a way that is accurate? You know, I have 60 pages of notes at the end of it documenting where I got all my information. I certainly didn't want to make anything up or have anything that I couldn't point to and say, no, this is where it came from, but at the same time make it readable. And it means a lot to me that you said it that way, because that was my goal. Was I want this book to be readable. I want people to be able to sit down, and I don't want it to be thick. You know what I'm saying? Like, I want it to be something that's pleasurable to read, but that tells you a story you didn't know. And I feel like, based on what a lot of people have said, that we may have achieved that, which is great.
Yeah, I couldn't concur more. It's just fantastic. I want to dig deeper into some of the O'Day stuff, just to try and grab some people's imagination who maybe aren't thinking right now, I'm going to get this book, to really capture some of the essence of some of the stories within this book. Just tell us a bit more about this guy, and then tell me about how the fact that I was speaking to someone today, and you've mentioned this before, how this would be a great film, and I'm going to start lobbying, I think. I'm going to try and get a 10-minute short done, and we're going to try and make this a motion picture.
He would be a great movie, wouldn't he? Because part of the issue with a book is, if you're writing nonfiction, is you have to have all your facts in a line. But O'Day did this great job of kind of having this mystery that surrounded his life that in a lot of ways was never solved. I mean, there's some parts of what he did that I really can't tell you what went on. But the beauty of it is, in a movie, you could just make it up. It would be, I think I have a sneaking suspicion as to what happened on a lot of things. But you're not bound by the rules of nonfiction writing when you put together a Hollywood film. So I do think he'd make a great movie. He's this kind of dashing Australian, incredibly good looking, a real ladies man. And he's this amazing superstar who comes to Madison, Wisconsin, which is a really neat town now, but then it's really kind of an outpost. And, you know, his foreign accent and his, as I said, his good looks and just there was an air of mystery that surrounded him. And then he's this big superstar that really put the University of Wisconsin on the map. You know, I don't know how much your audience would know this, but, you know, the University of Wisconsin is a massive school. I mean, I was just there last week. I mean, it's a school of probably 45,000 students. And Yale and Harvard and those schools are obviously much smaller now. But back in those days, it was reversed. Wisconsin was a nothing school, and Yale and Harvard, these were the huge schools in the country. And so the whole Midwest was just looked down upon. There was a point I talk about where Harvard went out to play, or Michigan, I should say, went out to play Harvard. And one of the Boston papers referred to them as crude blacksmiths, miners, and backwoodsmen. So this was the view of a whole part of the country, that these people were just backward. And Pat O'Day helped put that area on the map. He was a fabulous player. He had his background in Australian rules football, which is a kicking game, as you're probably aware. And football, American football in those days was a kicking game as well. Obviously now it's much more of a running and passing game. And so he was this incredible superstar. And then he had this exotic, mysterious life, which basically went completely off the rails, to the point where he was presumed dead at one point, and then quite magically and mysteriously reappeared. And the end of his life is kind of a fantastic tale, which, as you said, has a lot of Hollywood trappings to it, no doubt.
And I don't even know who you could compare that to in all these years since. Again, if you use the scale and scope to try and, you know, national attention, we got the worldwide leader now with Johnny and stuff. I don't even think those people compare right, because of the off-the-field stuff. And even if they disappeared now, they would maybe be such a bigger deal as it was then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you could disappear, right, in the way that O'Day did. I mean, he literally dropped off the face of the earth and was presumed dead for 15 years. I don't want to give too much of it away, but I mean, it's an amazing story. So I think it would be difficult, but his reappearance was a national story. I mean, it was the headlines. The San Francisco Chronicle broke the story, and it was the headline of their entire newspaper. Just to give people a sense, he went back to Wisconsin for this homecoming celebration. Returning home, they welcomed him back. And the Associated Press, you know, the national wires, dispatched a reporter to follow Pat O'Day on the train from California to Wisconsin. And, you know, Dateline Omaha, Pat O'Day got off the train and talked about his return to Madison. And that was a story that appeared in newspapers all over the country. I mean, it was a huge deal. So, yes, had there been television at that time, had there been the worldwide leader, yeah, we probably would have been getting breathless accounts of Pat O'Day's return. As it was left to the newspapers, and it was pretty amazing stuff.
Some of the things that I love in the book, because I'm just a major critic of the NCAA, and we could spend hours going into all the reasons why, is when I then look back and I see that there's so many comparisons to the modern era when you've got, you know, cigar companies, cigarette companies putting players' faces on it. You just transport it now to EA with their video games. It's the same thing, just hundreds of years.
That's what's so amazing. And that basically, I mean, you hit on what is the thesis of the book. There's nothing new under the sun. All of this stuff has happened before. As you mentioned, scope and scale are different because scope and scale at the time were different. But in terms of the issues that we're confronting and the positive stuff, I mean, the fact that it's a big deal and that universities use it as a rallying point for students and that it's a way to show your school pride, all of that stuff happened then too. But yeah, I mean, the whole Ed O'Bannon situation and whether or not players ought to be able to profit off the name, image, and likeness. There was a player at Michigan in the early 1900s, Willie Heston, who was one of the great stars of the early game. And on campus in Ann Arbor, they sold Willie Heston cigars. And he got a part of the profit. Same thing at Yale. There was a guy, James Hogan, who was a great star, and he cut a deal with the American Tobacco Company where they sold cigarettes with his name on them, and he got a piece of the profit. So none of this is new. I mean, that's 110 years ago, Ollie, and it's the exact same story. So this kind of notion, I almost think it's like an arrogant notion that, well, we're living in times that people back then couldn't understand. So much has changed. No, it really hasn't. I mean, there's just these human nature components, certainly to this sport, and I would argue to many other things as well, that are just inherent in what we do. I just think this is human nature. You've got these guys who are stars, and people are going to try to profit off it, and they're going to try to profit off it. And that's not new. The amount of money that's involved, certainly their stature and the publicity, that has changed because the world has changed. But the underlying issues are the same.
I don't want to spoil any more of the book for anyone, so it's the opening kickoff, The Tumultuous Birth of a Football Nation. If you're living internationally and you don't want to use the Amazon.com service, I implore you to go to daverevsine.com, click on the download links, go to Books A Million, their link there, and you can get an ebook of it. So I encourage people to go and find it there. Before I let you go, though, I have to ask you about Braxton. Are you very disappointed? Are you upset? Is it nice that it changes the complexion? It almost makes Ohio State football more interesting this year.
Yeah, it does to a certain extent. I mean, it's tough for the league, clearly. You know, I cover the Big Ten. I mean, this is what I do. I just got off a bus yesterday where we went to 14 schools over 17 days, 3,600 miles, watching every team practice, which was wonderful. I'm certainly not complaining about it. But, you know, I want the Big Ten to be good, Ollie. I mean, it's important for the league that it is good. And the loss of Braxton Miller hurts. I mean, I think it would be foolish to argue anything else. If he comes back next year, I mean, they'll be phenomenal, no doubt about it. But this was a team that was going to be in the hunt, I think, for the college football playoff. I'm not convinced they were the best team in the league based on what we saw. I think Michigan State might be the best team in the league. But Ohio State was right there in that conversation, and certainly nationally they were perceived as the best team in the league. And so it's a blow. I mean, I didn't get a great sense for J.T. Barrett when we were there. He clearly, Urban Meyer recruited him to run this offense. So Urban Meyer believes in him, and he's been a great developer of quarterbacks through the years. But whenever that timetable is accelerated for a player, whenever they're in the spotlight a year earlier than they think, I think sometimes it doesn't go as well as you might hope. We saw it in our league with Tommy Armstrong at Nebraska last year. Didn't have a great year. I think he's going to end up being a really good quarterback in our league. And I'm hoping for Ohio State's sake that J.T. Barrett's situation isn't the same, that he is able to kind of not master the position, but at least be good in the position in that first year.
I agree with you, by the way, on Michigan State. People nationally, I think, are really sleeping on them. And they're going to shock a few people with how dominant they'll look up front against Oregon in week 2. That'll be, I think, their national blow-up game, and everyone will pencil them into the Final Four. Are they who you're putting all the money on, or are we just going with them for the Big Ten?
Yeah, you know, my line is always, I don't make predictions. I make fun of the guys who make the predictions. It's a great position to be in as a studio host. You know, you can kind of turn to Jerry and Howard, who are our analysts, Jerry Gennaro, Howard Griffith, and say, what do you guys think? And then when it goes off the rails at the end of the year, you can bring back that video and you can laugh about how silly they were. But since you put me in that position, I would say Michigan State. I mean, they are a physically really impressive team. Because of Pat Narduzzi, I think you always just assume they're going to have a great defense. He's the defensive coordinator, as you know, and he's done such a good job. And then offensively, they basically have everyone back. I mean, I do think that people have kind of lost sight of how good that offense was at the end of last year. It certainly wasn't good at the beginning, but by the end of the season, it was really solid. And it is married well to their defense. You know, in other words, philosophically, what they do on offense makes sense with what they do on defense. They built an offense with an eye on the whole team, not just with an eye on let's go out and score as many points as we can, but with an eye on how do we rest our defense, how do we get our defense ready. You know, that kind of downhill rushing attack really helps them be more physical defensively. So it's just a smart program. Mark D'Antonio's done a great job, and I do think, regardless of what happened with Braxton, they were the favorite coming into the year.
And the final one I got for you is just the Big Ten as a whole. I'm writing about the league today, and I love Kyle Flood at Rutgers, so I'm happy to see them, and I think we'll see a sort of Penn State renaissance coming through. I don't think the league is in a bad shape, as maybe nationally they want to look at the Big Ten and say this massive divide between Ohio State. I kind of like the league. I think it's going to be a really good year.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think there's kind of this, the Big Ten, look, the Big Ten has the biggest schools, has the most money, and so I do think that because of that, a lot of people like to knock the Big Ten off its pedestal and criticize it when it's down. And that's a narrative that people have latched onto. I am in your camp. I don't think that the league is down in the way that people perceive it to be. I think Penn State will eventually be very good because of James Franklin. I I do think they're going to struggle some in a couple key positions this year. But in going to Nebraska, that's a really good team. We spent some time with Iowa. I think they're going to be very good. Wisconsin has certainly been good in recent years. Their schedule's more challenging than those other two in the West. And then Michigan State, Ohio State will still be good. I think Michigan might be better than people expect. So there are a number of teams in the league that I think can compete on a national level and can give the Big Ten some credibility this year. And from the position I sit in, hopefully one of them at least is able to sneak its way into the playoff and make some noise national.
Well, Dave, I have to thank you for coming on. I hope people don't mind the personal nature of this interview. I had to talk to you about this book because I think it's fantastic, and I just hope people go up to daverevsine.com and find all the links off of there for the way they can get it in their respective countries. It's the opening kickoff, the tumultuous birth of a football nation. I loved it, and thanks for joining me.
Oh, I am thrilled you loved it. Thanks a lot for your time, Ollie. It was really neat to talk to you.